This is going to be a really quick video on an interesting Talmudic text, which I've been aware of for years, and I figured I'd make a video on it. It sometimes comes up in discussions about the conflation of phonemes, or the blurring or loss of phonemes in ancient Aramaic, and I guess by extension or in an adjacent sense, also in Hebrew as well. So the precise page of Talmud that we'll be looking at is in the Babylonian Talmud, and it's tractate Eruvin 53b. And if we can zoom in a bit and then jump right in, the relevant text begins as follows. Bnei Galil de la דייקי לישנא. The sons of the Galilee, or, a little less literally, Galileans, are not careful in their language, right? What it's saying is that the people of Galilee are not observant or watchful or on guard regarding their language. דייקי, לישנא is the language, right? And then the text continues, AlMaseeHee, which literally means, what is it? But, basically it's asking for an elaboration or an example. And then the text proceeds to provide an example with the story. Detnיא דההוא בר גלילה. It was taught that there was a son of the Galilee, a bar Galilah, basically a Galilean. דההוא גזיל. Now, if I can pause here for a moment. Now, someone will say that's actually azil, but when the first time I looked at this text, that word, which I perceived as qazil, it gave me fits, right? Because I wrongly thought that the root had to be Kof Zayin Lamed. And so I tried to look that up in Marcus Yastrov's dictionary, which is a great resource when you're trying to, work your way through a Talmudic text. And it was the only source I had available when the first time I looked at this text. And, I wound up being frustrated because there was no entry for that presumed root, Kof Zayin Lamed. And I would only learn years later that the kof here is actually a prefix, right? And this is an instance where, trying to play the game, the sort of game that I was playing, which is where you come to the Aramaic text with a bit of familiarity with Hebrew and thinking that would be good enough, doesn't help in an instance like this, because as far as I know, this is a construction that doesn't have a parallel in, Hebrew. You don't have instances in Hebrew where there's a kof prefix on a verb. And Yitzhak Frank's book, Grammar for Gemara and Targum Onkelos, which is usually a great resource for working your way through a Talmudic text as well, even there, the relevant construction only gets mentioned once in passing, right? And it's like buried in a footnote at the bottom of page 133. And I can say, from personal experience that that brief treatment of the subject is easy to miss because, I had this book for years and I myself missed it for those years. There were years passed before I noticed it. But what really made this accessible for me, what unlocked it for me and enabled me to understand what was happening here was Michael Sokoloff's dictionary, Dictionary of Jewish Babylonian Aramaic of the Talmudic and Geonic periods, as he has a long entry on kof alef preceding a participle, or just kof being prefixed to a participle. And he provides examples to, elucidate how that works. And beyond that, his entry for the alef zayin lamed root, which is the actual root that's being used in the portion that we were just looking at, his entry for that root touches on precisely the term in question, which is actually azil, whether it's kof aleph and then azil, or if it's like a kof, being treated as like a prefix on the verb. But either way, azil means going or walking. So that phrase, דההוא azil, means he was going or, he was walking. So, getting back to the text, it mentions a Galilean who was, going along. And then it states the following, Amar lehu, and he said to him, or he said to them, Amar leman, right? So leman means literally to who. So the Galilean was asking for an amar, right? He's saying literally an amar to who, right? Who has an amar, or who can I talk to about acquiring an amar, right? And of course that raises the question, what is an amar, right? And here it has an alef. Oh, by the way, one quick technical note. Notice that amar leman uses the word amar with an alef twice, but it's worth noting that on page 636 of Sokoloff's dictionary, there's an allusion to a textual variant where rather than have amar with an alef twice, it has amar and hamar. where the second instance is spelled with a het instead of an alef, right? And that's actually relevant to this story because, what we're talking about here is confusion of phonemes and stuff, right? But the text continues. Amarule, they said to him, so some people responded to him, Galilah shote, stupid Galilean, Hamar le mirkab, or Khamr le mishteh, a donkey, Hamar, to ride, or wine, Khamr, to drink, right? Like, what are you referring to here, right? Hamar or Khamr, right? So they're asking him to clarify what he's referring to. Oh, and by the way, there's a bit of irony here because the text is about, imprecision of language, but the text, at least, for me, winds up being a bit vague. As you'll notice, the spelling of these two words is the same, right? So the pronunciations that I went with here are sort of like based on the corresponding Arabic terms for donkey and wine. And as I covered in my old video on Arabic phonemes in ancient Hebrew, I do believe that just as ancient transliterations showed that Hebrew and I would say by extension Aramaic both had an ayin and ghayin, so too the same ancient transliterations or the same ancient sources provide transliterations that show that ancient Hebrew and Aramaic had both het and chet. And, you can see that in the Septuagint renderings of Genesis 31:6, where the word for my brother, achi, in the name achisamach, is transliterated as if with a het, right? While, in Genesis 34:2, where the word for donkey is treated as if it has a softer sound, like het, right? So het and chet, right? That's the implication here, corresponding to how the Arabic works, right? But basically, getting back to the text, this Galilean is being asked if he meant Hamar or Khamr. And then right after that, there are more possibilities proposed as to what he might be referring to, right? So there's Amr with an ayin, as they propose Amr le milbash, wool to wear. Labash is, a typical verb for like wearing something. And then another option is given, or Imar with an alef, right? Imar le itqasa'a, right? A sheep to slaughter. And another quick note here about that last verb, itqasa'a, one would think that, from its structure, that it's probably from the kaf samech yod root, in which case the verb would mean to cover, like a sheep or a lamb to cover, which would be kind of confusing. But once again, Sokoloff's dictionary is helpful here as it puts this precise line as an example under the nun kaf samech root, which gives rise to a verb to mean slaughtering. But whatever the case, the point ultimately that I wanted to convey is that this short bit of Talmudic text, in this text we find the complaint that certain folks in the Galilee were employing pronunciations which blurred the distinction between alef and ayin and het, and perhaps so too chet, het and chet, alef and ayin, right? All this was getting blurred together, as well as certain vowels apparently, the vocalizations apparently were getting blurred together as well. So what we see is that a loss of phonemes and apparently a loss of vowels, a less careful approach to vowels in Jewish Aramaic, and presumably so to Hebrew, was itself ancient. And so I just wanted to share that, that this is actually discussed as early as the Talmud. And I hope others found this brief video interesting. But either way, I invite others to share their thoughts, whether positive or negative. And God bless.